Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be doing our first book review of 2026 and our first in some time with white poverty. Now there are two kind of main themes, I think, of this book. The first is that there is an enormous poverty problem in the United States that reaches enormous quantities of people in the United States, and kind of tied onto this, people who are experiencing poverty are typically much less likely to vote. And as a consequence, this makes it so that there are political incentives to keep people in poverty or to not lift them up, insofar as there are interests, like corporate interests, whose goals diverge from those who are experiencing poverty. And a second part of that, or a third part of that, is that overwhelmingly the number of people in the United States who are experiencing poverty are white. And this is more of a numbers game than a proportionality game. There are more white people than there are other people, so even if proportionally black people, for example, are more likely to be in poverty in the United States, nominally there's far more white people in poverty. And this is kind of brings us to kind of the secondary theme, which is that there are a lot of narratives that divide us and get us to focus on these narratives, race being one of them. And this is the author's primary focus or thrust. He used to work for, or maybe still does, the NAACP, so he definitely has a sort of black lens slash background, not background, where he is coming from in terms of what he is saying, but the primary argument he makes is that we need to put these types of differences aside and instead focus on what unites us, which is that poverty is an issue for all Americans, not just those of color, because there's a ton of white people experiencing poverty, and not just that, the means by which we are distracted from the issue of poverty, and also that voters are disenfranchised, not only is to the detriment of black people, but also to impoverished white people. And so he unpacks this through a variety of myths and kind of ways of looking at things, and so we'll jump into kind of describing through these, and then we'll get to the ratings, and then we'll be on our merry way. So first, kind of just a little bit of a few considerations going into it is, one, this book was a gift for me. I did not choose it myself. I generally try and read books that are gifts for me at a little bit of a higher rate than I otherwise would, because I think that other people generally have different perspectives than me, and they are selecting out something that they think I should read, and so it's likely that they hit a blind spot. But also, I think that this issue is really important. In terms of any sort of angle through which people are being oppressed, I think that overwhelmingly issues that aren't of class get focused on too much, and the primary or most important issue is class, which is not to say that the other issues don't matter, but I think that in a lot of cases they become a distraction. And also I think that the most practically speaking headway you can make in any type of endeavor in terms of social justice or political movement is with class, because you can unite people across party lines in theory, but there are a lot of things that get in the way. Second of all, this guy is a reverend, and I am an atheist. So this for me is one in which there are parts of the book where he's like citing scripture in terms of evidence or theme or this type of thing, and I'm just entirely disinterested. Not entirely, it's like somewhat interesting, but to me it doesn't qualify as justification for any type of point. It's just interesting to see someone make the argument. And so all of the things equal, I would prefer not to get it from a reverend. I'd prefer to get it from like an academic, although to be fair, he is an academic, but an academic that is sociological in nature rather than, one that is from a theological background. And then kind of just a point of emphasis is he is primarily coming from the black perspective, but also of the perspective that we need to unite, and that to the degree that it appears that there are differences, this is largely brought about by myths in kind of the cultural milieu that are propagated by those who have a vested interest in disenfranchising not just black people, but just the entirety of poor people. Okay, so starts off with some kind of discussion about poverty writ large. According to kind of like the official way of calculating poverty, there is a poverty rate in the United States of 11.6%. However, the way that they calculate it is just not very good. They use a method that they use since the 1960s. What it does is it makes the poverty line 3x the cost of food, or the average cost of food. I think they have a specific buy basket, and they just calculate it all based on that. And the problem with this is that the poverty line, by the way, is $14,000. The problem with this is that milk and eggs prices have gone up fourfold since this period in the 60s. Rent has gone up 16-fold. And so it doesn't really properly track what is required to have a kind of what I think most people would consider a life that is I don't even know how to phrase it, like standard, in that you have a roof over your head, you have like a refrigerator. That's a key feature that I know some people like to focus in on, that you have food, that you have transportation, these types of things. It is very difficult to do that on $14,000. And if you make $14,500, you are technically not in poverty. And so instead they use a different type of statistic. One is preferred, which is if you're not able to cover a $400 cost that suddenly comes up, if you're living paycheck to paycheck in this way, there's a different sort of line. And what they have found is for that line, 43% of Americans are at that point. So if they have a sudden expense that's $400, they won't be able to make ends meet, which is kind of a scary statistic, almost half, right? And so it is a big kind of problem. And then he goes on to talk about moral fusion, which is a term he uses repeatedly throughout the book. I'm not entirely sure I'm keen on the term, but it is maybe one that is important for creating a movement, this type of thing. But what moral fusion is for him is this bringing together of groups that are not typically together for the purposes of shared interest, in this case, combating the issue of poverty. And he talks a lot about his own lived experiences. I won't go into them too great of detail, but like, for example, him attending churches and giving sermons at churches that are traditionally all white churches in areas like Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, where he is from the South, I think North Carolina. I'm not 100% sure on the state that he is primarily from, but he talks about visiting these churches and there being kind of a through line, which is there are a ton of white people experiencing poverty in those areas as well. And then beyond that, he goes to talk about, okay, well, what are the obstacles? And he talks about 4 myths that are get in the way of people coordinating together. And again, these myths are propagated by stuff like think tanks, political parties, and this type of stuff in terms of narratives, because this helps to undermine dealing with the issue of poverty, which would increase political engagement, and this increase in political engagement would undermine them politically. So it makes sense to not just fail to solve people's problems, but to actively keep them and put them in poverty. The first is pale skin is a shared interest, and for this, it is kind of the narrative that it's not the issues of poverty that are undermining, your lot in America as a person who is white, but rather it is the African Americans stealing your job or this type of thing. These types of narratives. I don't have a particular striking example, but this is an entire chapter. The next one is only black folks want change in America, which is the notion that of the political movements, the primary ones who are like drivers of stuff like wanting voting rights, or the only people who would benefit from increased voting rights, is African Americans. This includes the notion that there's widespread voter fraud. As far as I can tell, there's not widespread voter fraud, and anytime I've ever asked, on a personal basis, anytime I've ever asked for someone for citations of instances of voter fraud where they claim it's widespread, I've never received evidence for it. And generally speaking, when I ask people for evidence of stuff, I'm not trying to have a gotcha moment because I expect that they're not prepared. I just literally haven't had, the number of voter fraud instances that I have had cited to me is probably under a dozen in total. And they are very often not from the side of the aisle, let's say, where they are talking about widespread voter fraud. But even if they were all from one side, 12 is not widespread, right? But If anyone has any evidence of widespread voter fraud, feel free to send it my way. But okay, continuing on, he talks about how there's 66 million poor whites per the metric, the second metric we discussed, which is in poverty but inability to cover $400 expense, and that poor people in general aren't really the ones whose interests are represented. And he does reach across, like, he, with Moral Fusion, he claims that he is not part of a political party, and he doesn't belong to a particular political party, but it's pretty obvious who he's voting for. Like, he's voting Democrat, he's campaigning for Democrats, this type of stuff. But I think in this chapter he does kind of rip on some of the more, as he would put it, moderate Democrats or moderate Democrats. I forget where the scare quotes go exactly, but the idea that I think he goes after Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin a little bit, but the idea that there is a occasional like flip-flop towards corporate interests. Now, I think he is perhaps a little bit generous, and I think that, generally speaking, over 50% of both the House and the Senate in the United States, on both sides of the aisle, largely kowtows to corporate interests, and would it's a very convenient thing that votes can just be pushed through or not pass by one vote, and a ton of people can save face, even if they didn't want to vote a particular way anyways. They can appear that they want to, and it's all just kind of a prearrangement. But he does go into it a little bit. The next myth is that poverty is only a black issue. Of course, proportionally, more African Americans are experiencing poverty in the United States, but nominally there's more white people in poverty in the United States, and so if you were to lift everyone out of poverty, it would help more white people than black people, right? It would disproportionately help black people. He doesn't really focus on the proportion very much at all. That's just kind of something that, in terms of a lot of the racial justice I would like to see, is of the kind that is kind of thematically similar to his Moral Fusion, which is that you should bring all people up and then maybe target issues that would disproportionately help African Americans, but you make all stuff more fair. And so that is something that I am kind of pay attention to a little bit. So affirmative action, in terms of my perspective, I'm not as big a fan of it, because I think you're trying to compensate through a mechanism that's not appropriate. But like an example is that judges tend to give, for convicted of the exact same crime, judges tend to give African Americans longer sentences than they do white people. Although the important statistic is actually, or the more important statistic is who the victim is. If the victim's white, they tend to get a longer sentence. If the victim's black, they tend to get a shorter sentence. But the point is that you would actually make all sentencing more fair if you gave judges less leeway, if you gave them less kind of a range that they could give sentences. And the reason for this is because of an effect called noise, which is the judge you get is entirely random. And while judges will generally agree on which crimes are the kind of least crimey crimes and which crimes are the most crimey crimes, while they'll generally agree on that type of thing, there are lenient judges and there are judges who, like, they give you the hammer, right? And the fact that you can just low roll a hammer judge or high roll a lenient judge is entirely up to chance. And the fact that they have so much range is actually unfair to everyone, because there are people who get the lenient judges when they've done something horrible, and if the range of the crime is a year to 20 years, they get like 2 years. And because that judge only gives 1 to 3 years entirely. And then there are judges who are like the pound me in the ass judges, right, who give 15 to 20 years only for the exact same crime, right? They might have ranked people in the same way, but since one judge is way more harsh, just the dice roll of which judge you have to get, it's entirely random and it's not fair, right? This is an effect that's not bias, it's noise, which is a slightly different effect. But in this instance, there's still a ton of unfairness because there's a lot of people who are serving way longer and way shorter than they ought to be. Bit of a tangent, but the idea is that when you solve an issue that is an issue for everyone, even if it's easier to solve issues that are issues for everyone. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this is such an important kind of topic. And this is kind of the point he brings in with it's not only a black issue, which is that there are more white people experiencing poverty. But okay. And the next one is that we can't overcome division as another myth. A lot of people will blame the poor rather than exploitation. I do have a kind of quote that I maybe wanted to look at on page 112, where I certainly wrote a note about wanting to take a look at it. And so let's read this through. As Princeton University Kevin Cruz has documented in his book One Nation Under God, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce surveyed Americans in the 1930s to find out who were the most trusted voices to push back against the New Deal. When they learned that preachers had the highest public confidence, they invested in a network of clergy who would proclaim gospel of individual responsibility and blame poor people rather than exploitative corporate practices for poverty, right? To offload the responsibility onto the people who are poor, and in particular, in terms of narrative, a tendency to racialize it. I do have another quote from 120 that's also from this chapter, but this one for me was a bit of a striking one in terms of overlay of map, although they didn't show it. There's no graphics here. On the first slide, our team at Repairers of the Breach had created a set of slides to help folks see how issues that impact poor communities interlock in U.S. politics. On the first slide, a map of the United States highlights areas with the highest level of poverty, linking Appalachia with long stretches of the South and the Midwest. On a second slide, we overlaid states that have passed voter suppression measures since 2010. These geographic areas matched almost precisely. Then, on subsequent slides, we highlighted areas of states that have passed anti-abortion or anti-LGBTQ legislation to fuel the culture war that has been pushed by the Southern strategy. He also unpacks the Southern strategy as well, quite a bit in the book, which is to make things more about race rather than class. With each overlay, the same areas of the country keep getting highlighted. When we showed the states that refused to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, the states matched up again. Then, finally, when we overlaid a map showing the highest concentration of white evangelical Protestants, there was again the same pattern. The data demonstrated what old miners knew from experience. The politicians who pushed culture war wedge issues, this notion of a wedge issue is also, I think, important because this is the thing that divides us and prevents moral fusion, as he would put it, and freedom from government had sold their message as traditional values to communities where a majority of the electorate were made up of white Christians. The places represented by these politicians were some of the poorest in the nation. And one of the things, again, to kind of keep in mind is that it decreases voter engagement when people are experiencing poverty. And I even have the statistics here. In his next chapter, he makes the argument that poor people are really the swing voters. And over the course of 36 years, low-income people vote 20% less than high-income people. And then there's a rather striking quote that came from Pete Buttigieg in an interview that the guy gave, or that an interview that Pete Buttigieg took. I learned a long time ago that if you were going to be loud, you better not be wrong. So our campaign did its homework. We asked some of the scholars who knew the data on low-propensity voters to run the numbers and tell us what was possible. In a report titled Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans, Columbia University's Rob Hartley outlined how low... oh, no, wait, that's not the one. That was just the statistic we just gave. But there was an instance where Pete Buttigieg talked about how one of the reasons that he didn't talk about poverty on the campaign trail and why other candidates don't is because the consultants, right, who to some degree are kowtowing to the interests of corporation, these consultants tell them not to talk about poverty in particular as an issue, right, to make it about and also to some extent the hot button issues are considered more glamorous to talk about because these are the ones that are proliferated in like the public narrative. And so if you look at all these news companies, they're going to be talking about stuff like abortion, right? Either pro-life or pro-choice. And this is going to, the idea is you make everything about these types of issues, and it becomes a distraction, right, to not talking about class. And I think that this is, like, for me, the biggest thing is that it's not that other issues don't matter, it's that they matter a whole lot less than class in general, and it's not that everyone, from my perspective, this guy comes from a much more empathetic, everyone has kind of a standard of living that they must have, this type of thing. But even if you were to just do it based on, like, a sort of scale where everyone fends for themselves, like, and they get what they earn and this type of thing, the amount of handouts that the government gives the majority of them go to corporations, right? And these are the ones who have the vested interest in pushing narratives that are not of class nature, because the people who benefit when the corporations benefit are the people who own the corporations, right? And so all of this kind of just interconnects into just being a larger class issue, one that, in my opinion, gets underfocused on. And so it was pleasant to read a book where this was the focus. So with all of that said, let's get into the ratings a little bit. For utility, I gave it a 6. I think if you are going to care about a political issue, the most important one is probably class/corruption. The two kind of together, because they're, in my opinion, inseparable, because corruption is allowing money to overly influence politics. The people who have money are the people who, own corporations and have this type of interest, and their interest is, it's a class based one, right? Where they want the extra wealthy to get the most of the benefits out of society, and so class/corruption, I think, is the most important political issue. And this book is not only focusing on that as an issue, it's focusing on how other narratives are detracting from that as an issue. So I think that's good. For novelty, I gave it a 7. I think if you've not been exposed to some of these ideas in the past, that's probably a pretty good shake. And this, I probably would have given a higher rating, except for, one, politics isn't everything, and this is obviously a political book, and it's not going to necessarily carry the day for a lot of other people. And also, there are other places that you can find the notion that class is an important issue and that other issues are distracting. But I think it's still relatively rare, so we did give it a 7 for novelty. For entertainment, I gave it a 4. He was kind of, I guess, pleasant enough. Both entertainment and style, they're probably detracted a little bit from the fact that he's a reverend and he's citing scripture, and I just don't care. And it's somewhat interesting to the extent that there's a little bit of novelty there, because I don't often read stuff from reverends and this type of thing. But kind of like at the end of the day, to me, there was maybe a portion of the book, maybe 6/8 the way through to 6/8 the way through the book to 7/8 the way through the book. Kind of a little bit of a lull where I just wasn't really feeling the book. I don't know the best way to describe it. But okay, I agree with a lot of his ideas and this type of thing. I think that sometimes I felt like he was contradicting himself a little bit. But maybe that was just kind of like the style where he was oscillating maybe between being technical and being I guess outspoken or something like this in a way that I didn't like. I don't really know. I wasn't a huge fan of the style, but there's it's not like he's just a bad writer or something like this. He was spoken enough. Book's very readable, so we gave it a rating of 7. And for interesting, I gave it a 5.5. I think it's a little bit interesting, but not too crazy, not blow your mind. And so we have an overall score of respectable 5.58. Generally speaking, when I'm rating books, I'm trying to rate in such a way that the average score is a 5. And so generally going to not see anything too high, just kind of middle of the road-ish, I think, for books that I end up finishing. But that was the book White Poverty. In terms of recommendations, I think if any of these ideas resonated with you in terms of having an emphasis on class, and if you wanted to specifically an emphasis on class coming from the lens of someone who is an African-American dealing with African-American issues and still making the argument that, look, you should still be focused on class here, and a lot of these issues are being brought up to distract from class, and being aware of that is an important thing. And also, to some degree, having empathy for people who may not have access to the same information you do, this type of stuff, then this is maybe a good shout. It's also not very long. It's not too difficult to book. I think that's probably you could have gotten the main ideas across a little bit faster, and that this could be a book where you think to yourself, oh, I'm just going to read the first third of it. I think most of the value is in the first third. Maybe that's the way you approach it. But for recommendations, if you're interested in politics and you're interested in that particular vein, it'll be interesting. Otherwise, probably not. And so, that'll be it. That's the review. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, YouTube algorithm stuff. And other than that, have a good one. Bye-bye now.